Today we want to talk about rites of passage. A rite of passage is something in your life that makes you realize that you have grown up. Sometimes these moments show us that we've grown up emotionally, and sometimes they show that we've grown up physically. An example of an emotional rite of passage might be when we take care of our sibling when they get hurt. When we were little, we might have been frustrated that they were crying and throwing a tantrum, but now we are older and we realize that we want to take care of them and help them feel better. A physical rite of passage could be a tradition that we take part in that marks our transition from being a child to a teenager or from being a teen to being an adult. An example might be getting our driver's license or our first job. Some cultures celebrate this change with a traditional party. In Latin America, girls turning 15 years old have a quinceañera. This is a party on her 15th birthday to mark her transition from girlhood to womanhood. These sorts of traditional celebrations span all cultures around the world. Sometimes these celebrations are well-known cultural events like a Sweet 16 or a quinceañera, or they might be traditions that just take place within your family. We at the Chattanooga Public Library thought about some of our own rites of passage, or events that made us realize that we were doing some emotional or physical growing up. We made flip books to help tell the story of our rites of passage, using images and detailed descriptions of how we felt during those times. We challenge you to think of one of your rites of passage and tell your own story about this event, including what it made you feel and realize.
To create your flipbook, you will need 3 pieces of construction paper any size, a stapler or a glue stick, a pencil, a Sharpie, and some markers. To create your flipbook, you are going to space out your 3 sheets of paper and then fold them over and crease. Then you will either take your glue stick or your staples and staple them or glue them all together.
Hello all, my name is Chrissy and today I'm here to talk to you about my rite of passage, which is all about my family's tradition of quilting. So my first tab is talking all about the matriarchy of my family. So a matriarchy is basically when the women of the family run the family. So within my matriarchy, there is a tradition of the grandmothers teaching the granddaughters how to quilt. And so my rite of passage is all about my grandmother teaching me how to quilt. So on my second tab, I talk about the history of quilting within our family and how it is very much steeped in not just the tradition of actually crafting the quilt, but it's also very emotional based. So historically speaking, quilts have been used in all different cultures as a way to tell stories and to pass those stories down from generation to generation. And in my family, the stories are also about what was happening at the time that the quilt was being made. Here is a picture of my mother when she was making her first quilt when she was about 6 or 7 years old, and you can tell that she had been working hard on that first quilt with her grandmother all day long. So my next tab is the story of my actual rite of passage. So growing up, I had my favorite quilts from my family that had been passed down, and I would take them out and look at them. I loved all the colors. And so after asking my mother and my grandmother about these quilts for so long, it finally was my turn to be taught how to quilt. So I was about 7 years old, and my grandmother and I decided that we would do a patchwork quilt, which is when you take squares of different fabric, sew them together to create a giant top. So she set me up with my very first sewing kit, and I would take that sewing kit to school with me and work on hand sewing my squares together, created a giant top layer. So after that was created, then she pulled out the quilting boards from the attic, which were actually her mother's, and we stretched out a bottom layer, a middle layer of batting, and the top layer. Then we got to actually quilting, which is when you take a needle and thread and sew all 3 layers together. So up and down, over and over and over again. And throughout all of this, we spent time together talking and sharing all different types of memories, and it was just a really special experience. The next 2 tabs after my actual rite of passage are just talking about the follow-ups from this experience. First follow-up that I write about is talking about my grandmother and how this experience was much more than just her teaching me a craft. It was very emotional, and as she grew older, she needed my help to thread her needle, and eventually it became too hard for her to quilt, so she passed off her sewing machine and the quilting boards to me, and now my grandmother eventually passed away, but whenever I am doing any sort of fiber art, I do it in her memory. So there have been points in time in which I've gotten extremely frustrated because I don't know how to do something right, and I can't call my grandmother to ask her these questions, and so I just want to toss it to the side and just give up on it. But I know that she would want me to persist, even in the difficult times. And that doesn't just mean with quilting, that means with anything in life that I'm going through. If something is very difficult, she would want me to carry on, and that's something that she passed on to me. My very last tab is talking about another follow-up to my rite of passage, something that is very near and dear to my heart, and that is that my mother and I work very hard together to maintain the quilts that have been passed on through generation to generation. So some of these quilts have been very, very loved, and thus their top portions are coming apart in certain areas, and so my mother and I will cut out new pieces and sew those to the patchwork and then quilt them on. So this is extremely special because we are adding to the story of the quilts that have been made by our ancestors. And as we do this, we talk about the women that had created these quilts originally. And so it has just become this really amazing tradition in my family. And all right, thank you so much for listening to my rite of passage, and I hope that this inspires you to write your very own. Thanks.
This is my rite of passage. So when I was 15, I got my learner's permit and started learning how to drive. But I was kind of a reluctant learner. I was a little nervous about it, and when I would ride in the car or drive, my parents would get nervous too. And their nervousness would make me more nervous. And so I really didn't enjoy the process of learning how to drive. And it made me reluctant to practice. So I was a nervous driver, and one of these times I was driving to school in the morning, and my mom was in the passenger seat, and I pulled out onto a busy road, and it was raining, and the car hydroplaned, and so it slid, and another car hit the car and knocked us into a power pole. And it was very, very scary, and it made me even more afraid of driving. My parents tried to convince me to kind of get back on the horse and practice some more, but I was just scared, and I wasn't interested in driving. So, and then they bought this old Volvo station wagon, and I really liked this car, but the problem was it was manual transmission, so I was going to have to learn how to drive stick shift. My brother was a mechanic, and he offered to teach me how to drive stick shift. He thought it would be fun, and he tried to make it fun. I remember he brought a CD to our first lesson and told me all about the inner workings of the car, and he was a really patient teacher, and we would just kind of drive around and listen to music, and I started to feel really more confident about it, and it ultimately left me feeling like a pretty good driver, and I loved the freedom of being able to go wherever I wanted to, and I ended up going to a college that was 5 hours away, and I loved my drives, and all because I learned how to drive stick shift.
My rite of passage story. Basically, I said that when I was a kid, I loved language and I wanted to learn Spanish, so I started learning from friends. Then I was a rebellious teenager. There's me being rebellious and my mom being worried. And I basically always said that as soon as I turned 18, I would move away from home and I would move to a Spanish-speaking country and be fluent, blah, blah, blah. Mom thought that I was being crazy. Then, 2 weeks after I turned 18, I moved to Nicaragua on, it's supposed to be an airplane, looks like a rocket ship, oh well. So, Nicaragua, Central America, here, I moved there and I became an English teacher at an orphanage in Managua. It was terrifying and I was the only English speaker and I didn't get to speak English ever, so my Spanish got really good. And it was a totally new way of life for me. All the food was different. I lived in an open air house. You can see here. I lived in an open air house. It was super hot. There was no AC, barely any internet. But I learned to love it, and there's me teaching English to some kids. It was extremely fulfilling, and I found a new passion for myself, which was teaching language. It changed my life. And because of that, I came home a year later and started going to college at UCC. So I moved to Chattanooga and I studied Spanish and then later got my master's in Spanish at a different college. And I started teaching and working with kids. And now I get to do that with the public library and do programming and outreach and translation and sometimes even teaching English, and I love it. And that's all thanks to my crazy trip to Nicaragua, which was my rite of passage. It was something that changed my life forever and helped me to become the person I am today. And I am so grateful that this crazy thing happened to me, even though it was super hard and scary. It helped me become the adult that I wanted to be. So that's it.